So then, we can now talk a little bit about the life of Muhammad. Muhammad was born into the Quraysh tribe. So that's really important because the Quraysh tribe were in charge of Mecca, basically. They were in charge of the Kaaba. And you might say, well, great, then Muhammad was part of a really powerful group. And in a sense, he was, but the problem was when he was young, his parents died. His father actually died before Muhammad was born. Muhammad's mother was pregnant with him, and after she conceived, but before she gave birth, Muhammad's father died. And then while Muhammad was still quite young, his mom died. So he was an orphan. And this is in a society where having a male older protector is very important. One thing I like to point out, if you read the Hebrew scriptures, they're always saying, protect the widow and the orphan. The reason they do that is people like to beat up on widows and orphans. They're just not able to defend themselves as well in a patriarchal society when they don't have a male figure, like they don't have their father. But Muhammad was fortunate in that his uncle, remember this is a tribal society, you know who your second cousin is, you certainly know who your uncle is. His uncle stepped in to act as his guardian. And his uncle was a merchant. So Muhammad became a merchant. And so Muhammad traveled around, right, trading. And he would have met a lot of different people, non-Arabs. He would have met people who believed in traditional Arab religion. I think there's a good chance he also met with Christians and Jews. And I think this gave him a wider view of the world. It gave him a view of something bigger than the tribe. And I think that's really important to understand Muhammad. Now, here's the interesting thing about Muhammad. To be a merchant, in traditional societies, people often mistrusted merchants. Merchants are important because they move stuff around. But remember, a merchant makes money by making you pay as much as possible for something, right? The merchant wants to get the price as high as he can, or she can. We'll talk about female merchant shortly. Wants to get the price as high as he or she can, because the more he can charge or she can charge, the higher the profit. Under those circumstances, and that's why people often would look at merchants and say they're dishonest. Under those circumstances, Muhammad gained a reputation as being honest and impartial. So he was a merchant who people respected as an honest and impartial person. He was so good at his job that he married his boss. There was an older woman named Khadijah who was a merchant who he did some work for. And they fell in love. And he was really good at his job, and they married. So they had kind of a business partnership, but also a romantic relationship. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but I do think it's important to understand the relationship he had with Khadijah, which will be important later on. People talk about Muhammad's wives. One thing I want to stress, he only had one wife while Khadijah lived, right? So while he did have multiple wives, while she was alive, there was just her. So she was very important to him. What's really weird then is that it appears that Muhammad had a personal crisis. Why do I say that's weird? Well, imagine this guy, he starts off not doing well in life. He's an orphan. But he's able to bring himself up with the help of course, his uncle and his wife, right? He goes from being a poor orphan in a sense to becoming a successful merchant, a respected member of his community, and married to the love of his life. Really, is it hard to ask for much more than that? Or rather, it is hard to ask for much more than that. But perhaps because he'd achieved so much, perhaps he's felt a kind of emptiness. Like, what next? What does all this mean? So one thing he did that was common during this time period was he developed, and perhaps now, he developed an interest in religion, right? If you have big questions, why was I born? What happens when I die? What's the meaning of life? Religion is something you may turn to as a way of answering those questions. And the story goes that he went a lot to go pray. And he would go pray in a cave. This cave, in fact. And this makes a lot of sense because the desert is hot. Caves go underground and are cool. So he would go there to pray, to try and figure out what's the meaning of all this. And Muslims believe that he had a vision of the angel Gabriel. If you're familiar with Christianity, that's the angel that announced to Mary that she was going to have a baby. That's what Christians believe. Of course, the baby Jesus. And this In this vision with Gabriel, he's informed that he is God's messenger and will be receiving God's revelation. These revelations, Muslims believe, or what Muslims believe these revelations to be, were written down in what's called the Koran. These revelations, Muslims believe, would continue throughout Muhammad's life. And in particular, whenever the Muslim community had a problem, Muhammad would typically receive a revelation that would instruct them what they should do. Right? So whenever they had a crisis, he would receive a revelation that would tell them what to do. Some of these revelations were written down, some were memorized. One thing I want to point out this is an oral culture in many ways. I mean, Arabs had writing, Arabic, but this is also a poetic culture. So their memories are going to be really good. So some are memorized, some are written down. A couple decades after Muhammad's death, they're compiled, and an authoritative version is published in 651. It's in Arabic, of course. And what's interesting, if I recall correctly, they're in order of length. So I believe it's called surahs. The Quran is divided into different chapters, and they're organized based on length. So remember I said earlier that poetry was really important? One thing I want to, and that one reason I mentioned this is because the Quran is essentially poetry. It's sort of like, you may be familiar with the Psalms from the Hebrew scriptures. Imagine if the entire Bible was Psalms. That's kind of what the Quran is like, right? It's written, like I said, in poetry, and that can make it very difficult to translate. And that's one reason why there's often commentaries that go with it, because poetry can be difficult to understand. So, for example, in poetry, what is often as important as what is said is what is not said. So this can make reading and understanding the Quran a little bit complex. My understanding, though, and I don't know Arabic, is that in Arabic it's quite beautiful because it's poetry. And one thing I want to point out, and this is what's tricky, because usually we understand things that we're unfamiliar with according to the categories we are familiar with. So, for example, if you're an American, you've probably been impacted by Christian, particularly Protestant Christian understandings of how religion works. And even if you're not a Protestant Christian, it's just because of that cultural dominance. And in a Protestant Christian understanding of how religion works, scriptures are central. Right? The Bible is extraordinarily important to Protestant Christians. It's important to other Christians too, but it holds such a central place. So if you're a Protestant Christian, you're like, okay, the Quran, that's like the Muslim Bible. And that's a great way to start trying to understand the Quran. I don't want to say that's a bad way. It's not. It's a good way. But I have to point out a difference that will help you better understand how Muslims understand the Quran. It has to do with authorship. So one thing that's kind of fun about the Bible is comparing different Gospels. So, for example, in the Gospels, when they talk about Judas betraying Jesus, most of them say for some silver. But Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew actually says 30 pieces of silver. It gives you an exact number. And you may say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, it's interesting because Matthew was a tax collector. And the other gospel writers were not tax collectors. They didn't care about the exact number. Matthew, you better believe he cares about it. He's a tax collector. He's interested in things like numbers. Similarly, you may be familiar with the story of the camel and the eye of the needle, right? It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. Probably you're familiar with that. Well, in the gospel, all the other gospels, they use like a sewing needle. That's the word they use. They have a word for sewing needle. They use that one. But Luke uses a different word. He uses like a needle that a surgeon would use to sew up a wound. What was Luke? He was a physician. Now for Christians, this doesn't bother them one bit. Because the Christian view is that, and I have to be careful here because there's multiple Christian views, but most Christians would say, well, yeah, human beings wrote the Bible, and they're in the Bible, but God made sure that they didn't make mistakes, or God made sure that they wrote what God wanted them to write, and it's kind of a cooperation, right? They work with God, God keeps them from error, makes sure that they get in what they're supposed to get in, but they can say 30 pieces of silver or just some silver, it's fine. That's not how the Quran works. For Muslims, Muhammad is not in the Quran. Not at all, not one bit. For Muslims, the Quran is a message from God delivered to Muhammad, delivered to the rest of humanity. You can almost kind of think about it like this. God writes a letter, seals it up, gives it to Muhammad. Muhammad opens the letter and then hands it out to people. But Muhammad doesn't write the letter. Muhammad does nothing to the letter. Muhammad is not, in that sense, in the Quran. The Quran is God's word and only God's word. And what's interesting is in the Quran itself, when Muhammad is challenged to give a miracle, and he says, I will not give you a miracle. You know, people say Jesus had miracles, the Hebrew prophets had miracles, where's your miracle? And he says, my miracle is the miracle of the Quran. This message straight from God. Now, here's the other thing I need to point out that can be confusing. So if you're coming at this from, especially from a Protestant Christian perspective or influenced by that understanding, you may think that the Quran is the only authority for Muslims, but it's not. Remember how earlier I said if a Muslim is not sure what they should do, they may say, what would Muhammad do? Right? That makes sense. Well, how do you know what Muhammad did? Well, there are things called hadith. And if you're ever watching like a TV show or something about that, something like that about Islam, and they say, according to tradition, or if a Muslim says, according to tradition, they're referring to hadith. Hadiths are sayings about Muhammad. They're stories about Muhammad that are not typically in the Quran. If they are in the Quran, they're usually kind of more detailed. And Muslims are very strict about this. Like, if there's a hadith, they want to know where it came from, and they'll trace them back. They'll say, like, this hadith was passed on from so-and-so, who got from so-and-so, who got from so-and-so, who was a companion of the Prophet. So it's key. And sometimes people, they misunderstand this. They'll say, well, how can Muslims do that? That's not in the Quran. And the response is, yeah, but it might be in the hadith. So that's something very important to note. And what makes things complex, you know how Christians might disagree about how to interpret the Bible. So Muslims may disagree about how to interpret the Quran. They may also disagree about how to interpret the hadith. And what's tricky is they may even say, well, I don't accept that hadith you're quoting. I don't think it is historically accurate. But that's key for us to kind of understand how Muslims understand their holy book, but to understand also that it's not simply a holy book. There's other things, other sources of authority that Muslims look to, such as the model of Muhammad, the perfect man, and also to these sayings, these sayings from Muhammad, these stories about Muhammad.